Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter Paninsky. And we are really looking forward to your investigation on the character and the life of Charles Edward Stuart.
Well, Katie, thank you very much for inviting me to do so, and I'll try my hardest. Charles's early life was characterized by Charles being thoroughly spoiled. And so his governor, James Murray of Stormont, the Jacobite Earl of Dunbar, said that Charles seemed unable to behave in a proper manner, and that he probably never would, so long as he lived in the Palazzo Muti, or as it should be called, the Palazzo del Re, amongst, and I'm quoting, amongst a few of his own people in Rome with whom he has constantly lived and who give him no manner of restraint. What his father was sending him to Venice to try and make him grow up, to try and make him stop being a petulant, spoiled, very difficult lad who really, who was not prepared to study or really do anything that he didn't want to do. From 1720, when he was born, well, on the last day of 1720, until 1737, when he was 16, he was a person with a grudge against the Scots who were around him. There weren't many of them. So he didn't really get into Scottishness, and he was a person who was very difficult, very spoiled, and generally was such a problem that his father had hit upon this idea with Lord Dunbar to send him off on a tour of the northern Italian states, but in particular to send him from there into the Habsburg lands so that he could go and be with the Habsburg army who were conducting war against the Turks at that point, basically to man him up. Well, he never got permission from the Habsburgs to join the army, but as it turned out, he didn't need it. No one was more surprised than Lord Dunbar and King James that Charles, when he started touring the northern Italian courts, suddenly showed himself to be suddenly completely different. First of all, I'll actually quote a contemporary, a very good and very close colleague of mine, Professor Edward Corp, who wrote, "It seems that Prince Charles felt liberated from the constraints of living in his father's palace, and particularly when he was given an extraordinarily enthusiastic reception as a kind of superstar wherever he went in northern Italy." Dunbar wrote that the prince was suddenly behaving as if he was 20 or 30 years older, and like a man in all respects. One of the people he met in Venice was the Field Marshal Johann von der Schulenberg. He was retired at that point, but he'd been one of Europe's greatest field marshals. He was a man of extraordinary experience. Well, he wrote about Charles at this point, that he publicly stated that if he were a young man, he would rather serve Prince Charles than any other prince in Europe. Dunbar then wrote to James, "I would have no difficulty in presenting His Royal Highness at any court in Europe." And James, with enormous relief, wrote absolutely delighted to his son, "I'm very impatient to see you again, and in great hopes of finding you quite altered, and that instead of being a child, you'll be able of being a friend and a companion to me." One of the things that's absolutely essential to understand about his relationship with his mother, and which tells us, I think, a great deal about his behavior after the 45, when he descended into alcoholism, is that Clementina changed from being a dramatic, dynamic, charismatic teenager. She was born in 1701, not 1702, as most people believe. She was born in 1701, and when she arrived in 1719, she was just 18 years old. Charles was born on the last day of 1720. So she was still a teenager. But then in 1720, even before Henry was born and after Henry was born, there were moments of crisis in her life, in her relationship with James, resulting in her going off, resulting in her going to a convent, coming back again, and so on and so forth. So that could only have been, to an extremely young child, something very dramatic, something very traumatic. Then began a descent into what I think surely we have to conclude was anorexia nervosa. Her behavior moved in this direction from really late 1727 on. So, Charles was 6 years old. She died in 1735. Charles was 14 years old. And during that whole period, her behavior was one which could have only caused strain on Charles's part, and was probably most traumatizing. Again, if we reach for something she said about herself, and she said this as early as 1725. She said that in writing to James, she wrote that she was doing her best. She was trying to overcome my naughty temper. James described parts of her behavior as the finest dissimulation and hypocrisy, to feign behavior whereby she seemed to be charming and wonderful. She was certainly capable of enormous charm to other people. And then, let's say, metaphorically, the door closes, James is on his own with Clementina, and she's nasty to him. And that's what he would have meant. Something along those lines would have been what he meant by the finest dissimulation and hypocrisy. Now, as far as James was concerned, therefore, he surely must have been traumatized by his parents, first of all, splitting up, getting back together again, splitting up, and then leading separate lives. And his mother then not only becoming haggard and ever more gaunt, losing all her beauty and radiance, certainly by 1731, 1732. She was always religious, but she developed a religious mania, a religious obsession. She became obsessed about the person of the Pope, and so on and so forth, all of which must have been exceptionally confusing to somebody who was witnessing an illness or a condition which actually people, even in our times, didn't really come to fully appreciate and recognize until about the 1970s, 1980s. Nevertheless, when she died, both Henry and Charles were absolutely distraught, were recorded as, weeping endlessly by her coffin. His father was a very worthy person, a very conscientious person, but he was patronizing. He was so decent, good, that he was probably boring. One shouldn't exaggerate. I mean, he was quite capable of going out with Henry and Charles and buying them ice creams in Rome and wandering around the place and having a good time. But nevertheless, on the whole, when he was serious, his influence was, let's say, a suppressing one for Charles. Charles quite obviously blossomed in 1737 because he was not with his father. I mean, he was a person who certainly showed in what he wrote to his father great respect towards his father. After that changed, in particular after 1747, when Henry went to become a cardinal in Rome. But until that point, he was very respectful of his father, which doesn't mean that he wanted to be his own man, as the events of 1737 quite clearly showed. Charles had almost no military experience. In fact, it was a Hanoverian policy to bring political pressure on anyone in Europe to prevent him gaining military experience. That was the last thing they wanted him to have. And insofar as that was concerned, they were very successful. That was one of the reasons why the Habsburgs, despite being related through Charles's mother, wouldn't accept him to go and become even a spectator, or certainly not to join the Habsburg army against the Turks. So Charles may have had may have inherited genetically from his Sobieski side a natural talent towards seeing military opportunities, but he didn't have any of the experience of his legendary great-grandfather, King John III Sobieski, which allowed him to temper his vision with what was in reality possible and not possible, nor did his youth and lack of experience and lack of a military CV allow him to command his troops as you would a professional army. Another aspect of this is that Charles had been brought up in the myth of the Stuarts' right to the throne. He'd been spoiled when a very young man, treated like a superstar from 1737 onwards, treated very seriously, but he was still very young, and so he had in his mindset was that surely it is obvious to the world that my family, should be on the throne. So his upbringing, his lack of military experience, offset an evident natural talent to see the possible where others couldn't see it, and all of this made him ill qualified to what he set out to do. One of the things that we will constantly see when coming back to Charles was that he either had his foot hard on the accelerator or he had his foot hard on the brakes. He knew perfectly well that the French naval and military might was crucial to a successful invasion of Great Britain. He felt absolutely convinced that if he was able to commence something, the French of necessity would come in. They would be forced to commit themselves. And then one of them so he launches his invasion, if one can even call it that, which was 2 ships, of which only one actually made it to the Western Highlands, and with literally a handful of people, and by his charisma, persuaded people to throw themselves into this uprising. And I then began to make the first of certain mistakes, one of which was to quite clearly imply at the minimum and quite probably promise the clan chiefs that he knew that the French would commit themselves. Well, he didn't know the French would commit themselves. However, I'm fairly sure that he passionately believed that he could trigger their commitment. And the French were notorious at responding extremely slowly. So Charles made a mistake by invading England so quickly, because he gave the French far too little time to be able to keep up with his speed, with his youthful enthusiasm, which allowed him to achieve a great deal, but which contained within it a lack of realism with regard to what the French themselves could do and how fast they could do it. Though being a person capable of great maturity and modesty and self-effacement, and indeed kindness and generosity towards his enemies, nevertheless, when he passionately believed in something, and if you don't passionately believe in something, you can't possibly have charisma, and you certainly can't get uprisings going. But when he couldn't get his own way, such as at Derby, when the Council of War voted down his wish to press on to London, and in so doing made a strategic mistake, which one can summarize in the following words: that whilst there was no guarantee of success by pressing onto London, nevertheless, there was a guarantee of failure by retreating from Derby. Those are the words of Dr. Christopher Duffy, who I think is probably who's a military strategist, a person who's lectured at Sandhurst, and who probably understands the 45 at least as well as anybody else. That was his view. So Charles took the right view but couldn't get his own way. How did he react? He was utterly furious. He couldn't even begin to believe that this decision could have been taken. And he went on to, if not sulk, then be furious and hold a grudge against Lord George Murray, whom he essentially blamed for that decision. That was childish behavior. He was furious, he was sulky, he was very angry with Lord George Murray, but it was George Murray who was probably the main author of the plan to launch a surprise night march on the Hanoverian camp at Nairn, believing that as the previous day it had been Cumberland's birthday, that the army would have been given too much to drink. It would have been they wouldn't be expecting this, it sounded like a good idea. And immediately, Charles forgets all his anger, all his annoyance, his frustration with Murray, and well, metaphorically, slaps him on the back, gives him a big hug, and forgets about it immediately. He wrote a well-known letter to the clan chiefs, which was badly worded. It contained all the wrong messages. And the message was quite simple. Simply, look, I'm going to try and escape to France. And it was understood as an abandonment by the clan chiefs because, that was contrary to Gaelic Highland culture. That was something of which Charles knew little. After all, Highlanders had not, or clan chiefs, great clan chiefs, had not played any role in his upbringing. So, we can understand that he misjudged that. Cameron of Lochiel understood perfectly that this was the worst thing he could possibly do, but attempts to sort of to prevent Charles from escaping and then ultimately getting back to France for various reasons didn't happen. Charles, on the other hand, was quite right in realizing that, one, if he was seen to be elsewhere, i.e. France, that would take quite a lot of the pressure off the Highlands, who were being treated quite appallingly by Cumberland and by the Hanoverian regime. If it wasn't genocide, it was certainly terror, and it was certainly cultural genocide. He also understood exceptionally well, but everyone understood that as well, that unless the French threw themselves into this, nothing was going to help. So without going to France, and if he didn't go personally to France, then there was no chance the French would help whatsoever. So he saw it again, as this is the only course open to me. I have to get back to France, take the pressure off Scotland or the West, or the Highlands and Islands anyway, and persuade Louis XV to launch an attack with me, especially now that the Highlands and Islands are seething with rage because the Hanoverian reprisals after Culloden seemed to take no consideration of whether an individual or a group or an area or a village or a clan area was, in inverted commas, guilty or not guilty. Essentially, what happened in the period from 1746 to the end of 1748, when he was ejected from France, there were two essential themes to that period. One theme was to do absolutely everything possible to heap pressure on his cousin Louis XV and the French ministers to restart a rising. And I think that the politics was completely against him. His father was urging him to stop putting so much pressure on the French because his father was extremely experienced and understood that this was not the right time. This was not going to happen. But that was not Charles. Charles still had his foot hard down on the accelerator. Mid-October 1746, Charles has only just got back to France. And he responds to a letter from his father by writing to him, "How can you imagine that I can enjoy any pleasure or amusement when I have continually before my eyes the cruelty with which my poor friends are treated?" The friends, he's only speaking about the Highlands and Islands. In March 1747, just a few months later, he wrote to Sir Thomas Geraldine, "It will be absolutely necessary to relieve the poor people of Scotland who are in the greatest misery as soon as possible. Though the court of Spain have consented to send 3 vessels with meal for this purpose forthwith, His Royal Highness," never mind that this is being written in the third person, "His Royal Highness, however, thinks it would be better to venture only one at a time. His Royal Highness would have this vessel to be a 70 or 80 tonner, to steer her course to the Western Isles and to make either Barrowhead, the Isle of Coll, or that of Uist. At any of these places, the master will find pilots to conduct him to Loch Nanua or Loch Moidart, where there will be people ready to receive his cargo, which they may then set on shore in a night's time and immediately set sail away. to those people who think that Charles escaped back to France and just got on with his life and didn't care about what was happening in Scotland, I think any objective person reading reading his words from the time and the way in which they're expressed can only pick, and his words to his father, you can only pick up on the fact that he was an extraordinarily anguished, monumentally frustrated person who actually passionately cared about what was happening in Scotland. In this period of the 1740s, after the Rising, he starts one after the other two love affairs. I think this is far from without significance, both with cousins from his mother's Sobieski side, very much fueled by an active sexual element. And at the same time, he begins to drink more and more and more. So if we see on the one side his attempts to try and trigger the French into a new rising, his attempts to try and bring where he can succor and help to the Scots, his failure with regard to both, at least with regard to help for Scotland, some may have gotten through, but nothing that was really material. And then we see, to balance that he's drinking more and more and more, and he's not only thrown himself into two passionate love affairs, but his behavior that goes with it is extreme, right down to furious rages, which see him firing his pistols off in front of the central Paris mansion of the family of actually both girls. This second phase of his life, which we can call the heroic phase of his life, which began with his tour of the northern Italian courts in 1737, ended at the end of 1748 when he was expelled from France. Up until that point, his game plan may have been unrealistic, but whatever it was clear in his mind. But when the French expelled him and even rendered him an outlaw within France, I think at that point, he just lost his way completely. I mean, in 1752, we had the Elibank plot, which was based around the idea of assassinating the Hanoverian king and his family. It was fairly extreme and fairly wild. Throughout the 1750s, when Charles is leading a Scarlet Pimpernel type existence, one mustn't forget that he was intricately involved with the Freemasonry movement in Europe, and people were hatching plans all over the place. Charles was drinking, and so really, from the beginning of 1749 onwards, everything is fairly hopeless. Clementina Walkinshaw was the nurse who in Scotland at the beginning of 1746, when Charles became nastily ill with flu, looked after him at her uncle's house, Paterson of Bannockburn. She came from a very good Jacobite family. She was related to the Earl of Mar, or the Duke of Mar, Jacobite Duke of Mar. What's very interesting is this, that when the two exceptionally passionate love affairs began, first with Louise de Rohan, his first cousin, and then with Marianne de Talmont, née Jabłonowska, his much older Polish cousin, and for more distantly related. They had a different profile to them. They were both characterized by extreme passion and extreme behavior. Clementina Walkinshaw was a completely different sort of person, who I think that Charles, having been expelled from France at the beginning of the 1750s, felt that there's an almost palpable feeling that of him just being totally deflated by events, totally exhausted by events, and to return to the Jacobite girl who nursed him is very symbolic of, let's say, total exhaustion. Anyway, she was to be sent to the continent to join a convent, and plainly didn't want to do that. However it happened, word was gotten through to Charles that Clementina Walkinshaw was around and that the two could meet. They did, and Charles seized upon the opportunity to make her his chosen girl, and she quickly became pregnant, and Charlotte was born. We, I think, can assume that there was no marriage in any serious form. And they remained together for the first 6 or 7 years of Charlotte's life. But Charles, again, fell into drinking, began to treat Clementina ever more badly, until ultimately she could really take no more. And having been corresponding with King James in Rome, and explaining, how difficult her situation was, King James supported her in her decision to leave, and that was how the relationship ended. During this period, after his separation from Clementina Walkinshaw, who takes his beloved daughter Charlotte away from him, which results in him becoming absolutely furious. If we move the clock on a bit to the period just prior to his marriage with Louise zu Stolberg-Gedden, again, we can just read, we can get a glimpse as to what he seemed like to other people by reading their words, which they wrote at the time. He was very good friends with the musician Domenico Corri, and Corri even lived with Charles from 1767 to 69, and he wrote about Charles that he kept himself entirely private. He didn't see anyone. In his retired life, he employed his hours in exercise and in music, of which he was remarkably fond. I usually remained alone with him every evening, the prince playing the violoncello and I the harpsichord, also composing together little pieces of music. Yet these tete-a-tetes were of a somber cast. The apartment in which we sat was hung with old red damask with 2 candles only, and on the table a pair of loaded pistols, instruments not at all congenial to my fancy, which he would often take up, examine, and again replace on the table. Yet the manners of the prince were always mild, affable, and pleasing. Well, he had loaded pistols because he was constantly afraid, and rightfully so, of another Hanoverian assassination attempt. An English woman wrote, "His person is rather handsome, his face ruddy and full of pimples. He looks good-natured and was overjoyed to see me. Nothing could be more affectionately gracious. I cannot answer for his cleverness, for he appeared to be absorbed in melancholy thoughts, a good deal of distraction in his conversation, and frequent brown studies. I had time to examine him, for he kept me for hours. He has all the reason in the world to be melancholy, for there is not a soul that goes near him, not knowing what to call him. He told me time lay heavy upon him. I said, I suppose he read a great deal, but he'd made no answer." And one interesting one is from the Irish Major Edward Magoran, who in 1768 met him at his palace in Pisa. He wrote, "In his dress and exteriors, he closely imitated the customs of the English nation, and that whenever he met any individual of it in a public place, he was more than commonly civil to them. His equipage and attendants were not distinguishable from those of a private gentleman, excepting in the arms and liveries. Humble and unassuming as he appeared in his behavior when in public, he was quite the reverse at home, and had all the external marks of respect due to majesty paid him by his domestics. Some Italian parasites with a few Scotch and Irish adventurers filled the several offices of his court and household. Nothing irritated him more than to name a peer of Great Britain in his presence, especially if that peer had been created since the Revolution. This etiquette accepted, he was not proud, but very affable and readily mixed in conversation. When at table, ceremony was as much observed as ever. But as soon as the cloth was removed, all restraint was banished likewise. And as of late he had addicted himself much to drinking, he relaxed in his cups considerably from his dignity. He was then the first to speak on topics which in the morning it would have been highly improper to mention, and of his adventures when in Great Britain, which were always one of the principal ones. So that was the rather sad individual who then suddenly bucked up again when the opportunity to marry Louisa zu Stolberg-Gedden arose. But the tragedy of that was that she quickly turned out to be barren, couldn't have children. She was much younger. She was very intelligent. She was of a different caste. People have written rather harshly about her, but I don't think this is the time to go into her character, other than the comments on the whole are rather negative. And the couple split. Ultimately, they were formally separated. And when that relationship finished, having spent many, many years having totally cut off all thought of Clementina Walkinshaw and all thought of his daughter Charlotte, whom he once absolutely adored, he then fell upon the idea in 1783 and 1784 to invite Charlotte to come back and live with him in Florence. And then later they moved to Rome, of course. And this ushers in a final happy twilight period of Charles's life, but it also shows us some very interesting things about Charles's psychology. Charles cut Charlotte out of his mind, not because he didn't care about her. His treatment of her after 1784 showed that he cared about her enormously. His behavior towards her before Clementina took her away from the Chateau de Carlsberg to Paris and their final separation began, he absolutely doted upon her. No, he cut her out of his mind because Charles was incapable of anything except total focus on one thing. And in this particular case, he could only cope with the loss of Charlotte by cutting her out of his mind. But nevertheless, he puts his foot hard on the accelerator, but the gear is now in reverse. And in 1784, invites her to come and live with him, which he does later that year. His care of Charlotte is very interesting. Henry was extremely jealous that Henry should be Charles's successor. And Henry was always very careful of the Stuarts' rights to their royalty and the Stuart claims of royal succession. But Charles, in November 1784, wrote to Henry, and again, the choice of words are very interesting. The way he expresses himself is interesting. These are his words. I'm very glad to tell you myself that my very dear daughter, having been recognized by me, by France, by the Pope, is Royal Highness for all and everywhere. I do not dispute your rights. They are established because you are my brother. But I beg you also, do not dispute those of my very dear daughter. Henry was slightly concerned, if not very concerned to begin with, that he should succeed his elder brother with regard to the Stuart rights and not Charlotte. Again, Charles, in April 1785, writes to Henry, my daughter is doubly dear to me when I see her occupied in recalling to me a way of thinking which I hope will not change again, and which I love to assure you of the endurance of. I cannot describe to you, my very dear brother, the happiness I feel in expecting that someday you will play the part of a father to a daughter I have every reason to love tenderly. I don't think there was anyone towards whom he was more furious in his life than to Clementina Walkinshaw when she took Charlotte off and away from him. And yet, he was so happy during this twilight era in the last 4 years of his life, from 1784 to 1788. And he was so open to his daughter's influence that when Charlotte gently, patiently made the case for her father being gentle and positive towards her mother, Charles took this up really quite quickly. And again, these are Charles's words, which he wrote on the 3rd of January, 1787. Although I've charged my dear daughter, the Duchess of Albany, to tell you how much I was moved by your letter of the 18th of the past month, I cannot refrain from indicating also my sincere gratitude. The prayers that you address to heaven, the wishes that you make for my happiness and felicity, I believe most sincere, and it seems they may be realized since I enjoy perfect health, and hope in return that you may always be in the same state. My dear daughter, the Duchess of Albany, is also at this moment in the best of health. The sweetness of her nature, her good qualities, and her amiable companionship diminish greatly the pains and inconveniences that are indispensably joined to my aged condition. Rest assured that I love her, and that I shall love her with all my heart, and that I am and shall be your good friend, Charles. And that to the person who I think at one time he had hated and been more furious with than to any other living person during his entire life. Genetically lucky with regard to inborn talents, certainly they came in the main from the Sobieski side, whence his dynamism, military intuition, and charisma. But alongside a brittle personality, one capable of this wonderful charisma, kindness, empathy, generosity, perhaps not empathy, generosity of heart towards others, even his enemies, when things are going well. But almost nothing in between. And on the brittle side, when things go badly, a lack of maturity, lack of patience, a spoilt nature, which flew into a rage characterized by high emotion, hence his inability to cope with that degree of emotion, that degree of frustration, producing exceedingly passionate love affairs, extremely heavy drinking. And yet, in all of this, he had a great capacity to forgive and move on when given a really good reason to do so.
Thanks, Peter. It's been really interesting. I've really appreciated you taking the time to walk through Charles's character with us. So, yeah, thank you so much. It's been absolutely great.
We must act now. The hallowed ground of Culloden battlefield is under serious threat from inappropriate housing and other types of development. At several times in the past 18 months, we've been surrounded by planning applications, and it takes time and effort to try to fight them to protect this site. Please help us by donating to the Culloden Fighting Fund. You can donate via the website at nts.org.uk/donate, or by texting Culloden to 70970 to donate £5. We really appreciate your help. Thank you for your support. It means the world to us.
Donate £5 by texting Culloden, CULLODEN, to 70970. Fundraising payments and donations will be processed and administered by the National Funding Scheme, Charity number 1149800, operating as Donate. Text will be charged at your standard network rate. For terms and conditions, see www.easydonate.org. Thank you.